All right. So as I said, I'm Trent Morrow, owner of L&B Counseling. I love talking about this stuff. I find this stuff fascinating. From a brain development standpoint, neurobiology, just kind of how this stuff all works. So the things that we're going to talk about are things that I have read about, heard about, read the literature on, trainings, those kind of things. I'm by no means an expert. A lot of this stuff is just still developing. The science of being able to study it is still developing. And we'll talk about some of those things and some of those challenges. But for today's topic, what we're going to talk about are video game statistics, social media statistics, why video games can be so consuming, how social media taps into the brainstem, which is really for oxytocin and dopamine. And is all screen use the same? Is it a problem? Signs of addiction? And then how to win the game, if to kind of stay ahead of the problem, or if you have seen that there's a problem even within yourself or in your child or teenager. So we're gonna get into all that. Hopefully we'll be done a little bit before 1 or right at 1. And like I said, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box or just unmute and ask me as we go. All right, so some video game statistics. The growth of the iPhone and the multiplayer games, so things like Fortnite, Minecraft, those are the multiplayer games. Those are the ones, when we start talking about video games, those are the ones that have real interaction. But they've skyrocketed, obviously, since the mid-2000s. You think of Xbox, PlayStation, even PCs and those kind of things all came into vogue and into technology around those times. Currently, we have about 2.5 billion people playing games, and 1.2 billion of them are PC gamers. So the majority of them are on PCs. Mobile phones are the primary gaming device. So if you think of like Candy Crush or Minecraft or even Fortnite, a lot of these games, that ones maybe even that you play yourself or your kids are playing, we have these little handheld devices, and upwards to over 90% of Americans have access to a smartphone. So that's how we're primarily absorbing this stuff. Kids the ages of 18 to 25 prefer watching video games than they do watching sports. And so you can even trickle that down to a younger generation. They're more likely watching stuff on YouTube or Twitch, anything that's streaming, than they are probably watching a game. The Super Bowl, just for context, I think most of us think that maybe the Super Bowl is the most watched event in the world. And I'm just putting it in perspective. So in 2019, we had 99 million viewers of the Super Bowl. PewDiePie, who is a top YouTuber in the top 10 of YouTubes, in 2019 had 4 billion views of their videos. And then League of Legends, which is a very popular multiplayer game, it gets broadcast on ESPN and things like that and streamed all over the world, had 137 million viewers. So I just show that to show context that kids and even adults are consuming this content at a much greater rate than what you would think. 38% of gamers would like to go pro, but they actually have a better chance, a 1 in 1,000 chance of becoming an NFL player. So you kind of start doing the numbers. You got 2.5 billion gamers, 38% of them would like to be a pro player. And when I say pro, I mean someone that can sustain a living, not someone that is maybe on a local esports team and gets a little bit of sponsorship or gets entered into tournaments, things like that, but a pro, just like a pro football player, they are sustaining a living. So more likely to become an NFL player than you are a pro gamer. And then there are fewer males entering college and the workforce compared to 20 years ago. So 20 years ago, 60% of people going into college were males. Over the past 2 decades, that has flipped, and now it's 40% male that are entering college and 60% female that are entering college. And so that trend, those 2 lines, continue to go down. Women are going up and men are going down. That's also true of the workforce as well. So, a lot of things that we're going to talk about is not necessarily causal. And what I mean by causal is, scientific method, we study it, we have all the test instruments, and then we can prove without a doubt that this thing is occurring. A lot of it is corollary, which is there's this thing happening over here in this vacuum and this thing happening over here in this vacuum. And could those things be related? And so what we're going to try to show is that through the science, through the research, that there are some things that are occurring that may be causing and pushing on some of the things that we're dealing with as a society, especially in America. So social media stats, Gen Z, who is ages born 1996 and up, so kids that are high school, going into college, getting out of college, that kind of stuff. We've noticed from a corollary standpoint that, so there was the rise of Gen Z, the rise of technology, phones, smartphones, things like that. And at the same time, there has been a rise in, let's say, anxiety, depression, ADHD. And so some of that could be, it's hard to prove that out, what is actually pushing on which. And because we are more educated about what depression and anxiety is, kids are more attuned to it. They're more likely to talk about it, so that stigma has dropped. And so people are self-diagnosing, and we're just seeing it obviously more in the practice as well. But something that is tangible that we can draw data from is the Gen Z population has their hospitalizations due to suicidal ideation and even self-harming behavior has gone up, it's either in here or in the next one, 100 to 150%. And so that is something that is raw data. We have that there's no other generation in the history of the American developing world where we have seen that exponential growth in hospitalizations due to those behaviors. And so, like I said, we're going to kind of draw some things and tie some things into that to maybe why that's occurring. The biggest change in those behaviors has occurred between 10 and 14-year-old girls, so the tweens, and then early adolescents. Just to put in context, because you can't keep up with this stuff, between 31,000 and 43,000 apps are developed a month. So there's back in the day, be like, all right, let me check out this show, let me check out this movie, this, that, and the other. There's no way to keep up with the content that's being created. And we'll talk about some ways to kind of massage that if you can. Consider anyone that is on their phone 4 to 5 hours or on technology, but especially social media, 4 to 5 hours as a heavy user. 2 factors that they've found through the research that are causing some of the issues that are associated with social media is overprotection, and then not necessarily screen time itself, but what you're doing on the screen. So if you do the Behind the Door series with us, I talked about it last week, that screen time is not the issue. So the fact that your kid's sitting in front of a computer and learning right now, like they are maybe a couple of days a week or every day, that's not necessarily the issue. It's what they're doing on that screen time that matters. And then the internet, for everything that it was meant to be, and it was meant to be, to be able to connect, to be able to learn, to be able to grant access. It wasn't invented with the intention of kids being on it, but 1/3 of the internet users are children that are on the internet. And there's some things that, some negative things that we can draw to kind of corollary that kids' exposure to things are occurring at a much younger age because of that interaction with the internet. One more page of stats. So 4.78 billion people have a smartphone. That's 61% of the world population. It's much higher here in America, as I said. The suicide rate in the United States has risen from 11.75 in 2009, so over 9 years, to 14.2, which is statistically significant. And that's per 100,000. 7.4% of high school kids have reported one suicide attempt in the past 12 months. So that's 7.5 out of 100 kids. That's not to mention the ones that have had ideation and have not acted. Female students are more likely to attempt. Male students are more likely to succeed. And all of that has been a steady rise in the last 2 decades of 35% of those behaviors, like we were talking about before on that other page. Back in the 1990s, so it's corollary again, 1990s, the suicide rates went down. And then, here comes the 2000s and this decade, and you see that sharp rise in the curve. And so what the researchers have been trying to do is figure out what's causing that rise. And then in that tween age of girls, their attempts to hurt themselves, and it's predominantly through poisoning, has shot up 268% in the between 2010 and 2017, excuse me. Any questions about this so far? And remember, you can put it in the group chat if you want. Okay. So things I want you to think about as we go through this, and we'll come back to it at the end. But how has attention span been impacted by these devices? Right now, our attention span's about, or was, I don't know what it is since COVID, but was about 6 seconds. We passed the threshold of a goldfish's attention span. I'm not sure how they measure that, but the scientists have been able to measure that. What are the biggest fights you're getting into with your kids? Or maybe even your significant others, people, adults in your house? This isn't just limited to kids. What are devices doing to our sleep? What are devices doing to our mental state? Is the human brain built for a multitude of these social integration opportunities? So just think of inputs. Think of the number of apps or the number of places that you can get information. So whether you're streaming on a video game, but are we built to have this much social integration and social influence? And then how are devices impacting our conflict culture? Are we getting better at conflict resolution, or are we getting worse? So I'm gonna break down how games impact the brain, especially in a developing brain, and then how social media impacts the brain. There are some similarities, and then there's some differences. The limbic center is your pleasure and emotion center. It's on board from moment one when you start breathing and come out of the womb. And then the prefrontal cortex is more of your computer center, your judgment, reasoning, cognitive, tasking, those kind of things. It takes much longer to develop. It's generally not solidified until age 25. And even then you can do some things as far as programming goes, but it takes a long time to get there. And it's completely influenced by the limbic center and the emotions. And we talk a lot about that in the practice. So the way I want you to think of video games, it's like a slot machine that you think you control. And so you feel like you have influence on the payout and when it's going to pay out. And so what video games do, and when we talk about video games, we're talking about those really the multiplayer modalities. So like we said, like Fortnite, Minecraft, anything along those lines, the big game right now, Among Us, all those kind of games, they're like a slot machine. And slot machines are based on variable reward systems, which means every time you pull it, you don't know if you're going to win or not, but you think in a probability, like the more you pull it, the higher probability goes up. It's not true, but it makes you think that. And slot machines are very enticing from a sensory experience, like there are loud noises and bright lights, and when something cool happens, it feels really good, it lights your brain up. So when that happens, in a slot machine in a video game, you get this neurochemical responses, neurochemical programming. And so when you think you have impact over the slot machine or the video game, you get dopamine. And dopamine is something that occurs when you feel like you're doing something hard and it's on a really good path. You get adrenaline by doing this hard thing. And then dopamine's like this little connector in your brain right next to it, where it gets tapped and it says, well, this is good. You're doing a good job. This is hard, but it's well worth it. And so you start getting dopamine, and then you get oxytocin through these multiplayer games because you have an interaction and people may be, saying things to you. And so it's a very social experience. And so during the video games, you think that because we as humans like mastery, we want to, master the skill. And so that comes from a really good evolutionary place. But when it comes to video games and how they've tapped into this stuff from a neuroscience perspective is they know that accessing this dopamine and this oxytocin, you're more likely to stick with the activity. And you believe that if you stick with it and keep working at it, you will get better and better and better at it. And by getting better and better at it, it creates an advantage. And so, from way back in evolution times, like if you got better and better at something, let's say hunting, well, then you're the best hunter in the tribe. And that brings you accolades, that brings you recognition, it gives you power. And so they're into that response system in your brain. And so the last bell down there is when you do well, you know, someone's going to tell you did well. Maybe you go up in level, maybe you go up in rank, maybe other people are giving you accolades. Maybe you can brag to your friends who are virtual or even in person that, you know, I got to this certain status, or my win streak is this, or I did so many things on Fortnite. And so all this plays into the neurochemical programming that we naturally have, and they've come in and tapped into it to keep you on the game longer, to have you buy the next game, and just keep you engaged. It's a really good business model. And when they're doing things, they're doing beta testing and things like that, they'll have machines hooked up to people's brains to see how the brain lights up. And they'll test all these things. They'll do it from a very scientific approach. They'll, Fortnite will do a beta test where they'll have you play on this one terrain, and over here you play on another terrain. And so they're measuring how long you're playing, how interactive you are with this program. And so it's very scientific. It's gotten very scientific, and they have a lot of behavioral psychologists that help them develop these games. Any question about the games? Okay. So one more slide on the games. The more you play, the more you feel like you can master. That gives you adrenaline, which leads to rewards, which gets you dopamine, like we talked about. And then ultimately, you believe that will get you recognition. So you're the best hunter in the tribe. Something that naturally happens during kind of like tweened adolescence is this concept of pruning. So if you think of like a smattering of roads in your brain when you're 10, 11, all these roads are roads that potentially could be developed. Anything from it's your right hand to your left hand. And what happens is when you're not using something and you're using something more, say your right hand, you just naturally develop more of that pathway. It becomes larger. And you can see the structures of that change in a brain when they do that imagery. And so that's just a natural thing that happens. So, you know, you think about it, the more you do something, the more you're going to continue to do it, and that pathway is going to develop more and more. Well, one of the things that they've found, especially when it comes to video games, is there's this place in your brain, it's called the ventral stratum, and its job is to uptake dopamine. And so what they've noticed in these developing brains, and remember, developing is all the way through 25, that the ventral stratum for heavy game users actually grows. And that's so we can handle the capacity of the dopamine being uptaked. And dopamine is a wonderful thing. It gets us to do hard things. It gets us to go out and hunt and herd or whatever it is that we needed to do back in the day. But it also is the same thing that turns into addiction if it's unregulated. And so that's just like we tell teenagers and kids, like delay, delay, delay when it comes to substances. The reason for that is because the brain is so susceptible to that ventral stratum and that dopamine. So that's happening from a wiring perspective. We know that teenagers that show riskier behaviors, they're more likely to continue those risky behaviors into adolescence and young adulthood and adulthood. And when there's no limits given to that risky behavior, no regulating of it, then they're more than likely going to lead into these other things. And just FYI, I mean, teenagers already do risky things to begin with. It's the #1 cause of death in ER visits by far of anything else that's going on with people, with teenagers in the world. So there's a question: does increase of dopamine keeps you more engaged? It absolutely does. That's what they want. They want the video game companies. It's a business model. They want you to keep you engaged. They want you to like the game and pay for the upgrades. I mean, Fortnite was beautiful because it was free, free. But there's all these other things that you can get. You can get skins, and that's oxytocin. Like, hey, look at me, look at my skin. This is a cool skin. And all these other games, you can upgrade your armor and your weaponry and things like that. And paying for some things gives you the battle pass, when it comes to Fortnite and things like that. So, it's all about dopamine. It's all about that engagement, but it's also about oxytocin. That's why the multiplayer games work really, really well on that model, is you're getting the dopamine, but you're also getting that oxytocin recognition. Very few kids are just playing on campaign mode. They might even not even play campaign mode with the new, let's say, Call of Duty that just came out. It's all about interaction. Does that part of the brain ever normalize or go back to smaller normal size, or once it's larger, it's permanently changed? So the short answer to that is it can. It's not like something that grew and can't be shrunk. I mean, like if you stop doing something, other things get reset from a wiring perspective. So, I mean, that's the good news. It's like anything. Some of us are more susceptible to things than others, and some of that's because of our environment or just our DNA, our wiring that kind of comes along with us at birth. So there's a lot of variance in those things, and so just understand when we're talking about this stuff, there are some variables that go into someone having a much harder struggle with this than someone else. And just think of that purely in substance abuse terms, that there's some things that some people just can never touch and other people can and not have problems with them. And we'll talk more about that towards the end of kind of how to gauge that. All right, so I don't know if y'all have seen The Social Dilemma on Netflix. If you haven't, I strongly recommend it. There's a lot of good information. Some of the information in this comes from Jonathan Heitman, who wrote a book, and Adam Antler, who wrote a book, and then the Social Dilemma people that have a podcast. But they go into really good detail about the science. It's a long form, so some of those podcasts are 2 to 3 hours, but a lot of great information. The Social Dilemma, I think, was like an hour and a half if you have it on Netflix. But it's just really good. So the thing I'm trying to draw out here is, I don't know if y'all know who Sean Parker is. For those of you that are my age, you probably knew what Napster was, and he's the guy that started Napster. But he was also the former president of Facebook. And I looked this up because I heard it on a podcast and I wanted to make sure it's true. But he famously said, "We will get you eventually." And what the point of that is we're going to get everybody on this platform because you can't resist us. It kind of goes to that last bullet point, is if everyone is on Facebook, you're not going to be the only one not on Facebook. It goes back to that oxytocin. Like, we need to have a tribe. We need to feel that we are connected, and we do that for safety reasons, reassurance reasons. And so if everyone's on Instagram, and this really plays well, this is where they do a really good job, and I say that in a bad way, but they do a really good job of preying on that exclusion and that social pressure that your teenagers and tweens feel. I had someone tell me yesterday that their 6-year-old said, I need an iPhone, because some of their friends have iPhones. And so even though you can't be on these social platforms until you're, supposed to be 13 for TikTok, kind of like going to a movie, a PG-13 movie. If you're 11, you're probably going to get in. Or if it says M for mature on these video game stamps, like, no one's stopping you from buying it necessarily. So their goal is to commoditize your attention. That's how they make money. I don't know if anybody saw my Behind the Door last week. So if you did, it's going to repeat a little bit of this, but it's worth noting for those of you on here that didn't, is that Facebook started as pretty innocuous. It was just a way to connect and create groups and just be in circles and connect with people that you were friends with around the world, and to find other groups that you may be interested in. Well, some things fundamentally changed because the business model changed, and they occurred around 2009 or 2012. So during this time, Facebook created what's called the like button. Taps into that oxytocin. If someone says they like your post or your picture or whatever, you feel oxytocin because it's rewarding. It's a reinforcer that, hey, I'm good, I'm safe. And then Twitter went in and did the retweet. And they kind of played off each other for a while of just kind of copying each other. But the point of all that is to increase engagement. By doing the like button, the retweet, it fundamentally changed the way we were now interacting with these platforms. And it also, around the same time, the computers, they have exponentially grown in their ability to process information, and to do that information, spit it out very quickly and create these algorithms tailored to your attention. Their goal is to keep you on the platform as long as possible. And they'll do that through any means necessary. The two things that they tap into, and I talked about this yesterday in the Behind the Door, is negativity and confirmation bias. So we are motivated by negativity bias. We are motivated if someone says they don't like our shoes, that's going to motivate us to consider, well, should we change our shoes? Should we have different shoes? Should I wear shoes that everyone else is wearing? These powers are really, or these things are really powerful when you're a tween and an adolescent. They have great impact, goes into the negativity part. And then we are motivated by confirmation bias. So I want to go look for things that confirm what I believe. And so you see this polarization that's occurred just through the election or even during COVID. You get pushed out to these areas that they want you to go to based upon maybe something that you looked at, stopped on, or maybe even consider. They know what you're going to look at. And just as an example, and this was through a podcast that I learned this, that if you are someone that, and no judgment on this, I'm just giving you an example. If you are someone that believed in making your own food for your babies, well, Facebook knew that you were not too far from the next room of believing that you didn't believe in immunizations. And then that wasn't too far removed. The next thing that would show up in your feed is flat Earth. So they keep pushing you and push you and push you to these margins. And they're operating around the idea of a car wreck. The same reason that we just naturally stop and look at a car wreck and slow down is we're interested in the thing that is causing the disturbance. And so they're preying on those ideas, those concepts, those neurochemical concepts that we are predisposed to pay attention to. They call it the bottom of the brainstem because it's just stuff that naturally happens, and it was developed out of a need to survive as a species, and now they're just using those things as leverages to get our attention. Any questions about that? Okay, I don't see any. Just going back to the brainstem functions of shame and pride, something I talked about three behind the doors ago with this celebrity status was, now that you have a phone in your hand for the most part, and some people are doing streaming through Twitch or YouTube, but for all intents and purposes, when you have a phone and you have a camera, you now, and on a social platform, you now can become a celebrity. That Ryan's World, that kid who's, I think, 10 or under maybe, like, he's got a huge following. He's a celebrity. He's got his own products and advertisements, and he's a whole entity by himself. The point is when you have that, you are now a celebrity, and that's what you're chasing. And it's then the way what I tied it into was just narcissistic behaviors, child actors, and the outcomes that child actors have had historically, and just asking the question, is that necessarily a good thing that we're chasing celebrity? I'll give you a what if, or not, a case inference of this week of, I've got a kid who's in 6th grade who is now getting on YouTube, and he is not doing his schoolwork because he's so obsessed with going to look at his YouTube channel to see if he got a new view, how many am I up to now? And it's, you ask him why, and he's like, well, I want to be popular. And then it's like, well, what does that mean? Well, maybe 100 people, maybe 1,000. It doesn't have a number, and it doesn't really end. It's something that you constantly chase. There's a famous YouTuber named Markiplier who took time off because he was having such anxiety and depression, and he was an adult. And he was top 10, maybe top 1 at the time when he took the hiatus, because he was feeling this enormous pressure to continue to create interesting content while looking at all the views and all the comments from all of his subscribers. And he had millions and millions and millions of subscribers. And so an adult brain still struggles with this, but a teenage and a tween and even a much younger brain, they can't do it. They can't deal with compartmentalizing negative feedback. That negativity bias comes into play. Technology over privacy. I'll give you another instance of kind of an aha moment. A college kid I work with went over to a buddy's house and they were watching YouTube, and this guy had never seen this YouTube channel, never met the YouTuber, and within 6 hours, YouTube had sent this kid this YouTube feed, which meant they knew where he was, they knew who he was around and what they were watching, and this YouTuber that he had never seen in his life starts showing up in his suggestions. And he didn't really care. He didn't really think it was a big deal. He didn't really think it was a big deal that, people knew where he was. So this idea of trading privacy over technology, and how when we just click, terms and services, we're okay with that when we don't even read it. But we would probably read it before we bought a car, certainly read it before we buy a house. But there's things that we have just kind of normalized ourselves to, just to say, that's okay, I'm interested, I want this thing. Now, bring it back down to a tween or a teenager on these platforms, they're certainly going to hit click, because it goes back to everyone else is doing it, and everyone else is doing it. It must be okay. It must be safe. And so it's just, should we stop? Should we think about those things? Children have more influencers now, and adults too, than they've ever had in their life. Their circles expand so far, and it's like the question of how many friends is enough friends. And it's a really good word to say friends, because it gets into what is a friend. But when you call it a friend on a social media platform, it feels safe, it feels secure, you feel warmth. But is that really a friend? Are they behaving in a way that a friend would behave? So it becomes a kind of a talking point for teenagers and tweens and yourself too. And then, the thing that it started out as technology, the internet, all those things, was really good stuff, and it connected us. But now is the byproduct of how much influence it's having in our lives and our kids' life. Is that a good thing? Any questions? Oh, I might not be sharing my screen. You might be right. I am so sorry. Is that better? I apologize. That was a big fail. All this stuff will be up too, and I'll put the recording out. Everything that I've covered was just in the slides, so I apologize. So the next thing is, if you've heard me talk at some of the other pandemic parentings and things like that, the way technology is influencing our sleep, and this is anything that's emitting blue light. So whether it's a laptop, a phone, video games, whatever, the impact it has on our circadian rhythm is profound. So you definitely don't want to have blue light exposure an hour before bed, because that is going to disrupt that melatonin being secreted. It will cause it to not be secreted enough, which means you won't fall asleep in time. You will not be able to have a restful night's sleep, and you'll probably get up earlier than you intended, which will make it bad for the next day. I mean, restful sleep is tied to our ability to cognitively deal with problems, our temperament, our immune system, which now during COVID is more important than ever, and it's tied to our weight. So fat cells get bolstered if we don't get enough sleep. So long story short, especially with this slide, is that you need to be aware that these devices are influencing your sleep habits, especially for your kids. It's a question of if the device is in their room and it is turned off and turned down and no notifications, then even it being in the room, it is a distraction. We know that through studies that even I don't have my phone in here right now, because it's a distraction, because we're aware of it. If it was turned up and their notifications go off, then when it lights up, that light is emitted through your eyelids, even though you're asleep. And so that is a disruption in your sleep cycle. And so it's going to cause you to come out of that wherever you are and come up to more of an elevated state. And that's just an evolutionary byproduct of when the sun's up, we want to be awake. And when it's down, we want to be asleep. And so this is kind of augmenting that reality when we expose ourselves to that blue light. Give me 1 second and make sure I'm pulling up my chat box. So I don't miss anything. There we go. Sorry. All right. So all this is what we're going to get into now. Is that's just public service and announcement. It doesn't necessarily mean there's a problem in your life. It doesn't mean there's necessarily a problem with you or your kiddos. Things have come before, whether it was the radio or TV or Atari or any of these other things, and said, kind of a moral panic of like, this is going to ruin society. And if you look through the data, that kind of anthropological sociology data, that's not true. You know, TV didn't ruin our brains, break our brains mush, as maybe our parents told us. But going back to what I showed you earlier, something has happened in Gen Z to change that rate of hospitalizations, and which is not subjective, it's objective data. And so this is to give you guidelines for what to consider if you're seeing problems, to decide, is it a problem, how bad is it, and what to do with it. So this is just guidance, so you have something to work off of instead of thinking, you know, Chicken Little, the world is, or the sky is falling. So generally signs of addiction. And when it comes to technology addiction, in this country, you can't diagnose, let's say social media or video game addiction. It's not recognized yet. The World Health Organization, which is always in the news with COVID and stuff, does recognize it as a disorder. And it probably will be updated in the new diagnostic statistical manual that will come out. So we may be able to see it more at more prevalence. So just generally, signs of addiction are unsuccessful attempts to reduce or stop the behavior. So whether that's social media or video games, loss of interest in previous hobbies, and not new ones picked up. So let's say your kid was 8 and they kind of stopped doing Legos, and now they're into drawing or something else. Continuation despite there being problems. Problems could be academic, interpersonal, social hygiene, you name it. Jeopardization or loss of relationship, job or opportunity. Preoccupation, so being absorbed by the device, thinking about what you're going to do when you get on the device, what happens when you get off the device. Withdrawal, so irritability, restlessness, and sadness when you're off the device and not getting it. And then tolerance, which means you need more of it. You're on it more, you're playing it more, you're interacting with it more. You're using it as an escape from reality to just not deal with life's problems, life's challenges, things that we normally have to do and get through. And we are deceiving others. So we'll see this a lot in the practice that kids will get up in the middle of the night and try to jimmy the lock of where the device is. So whether that's the game console or the phone, or they'll go downstairs and unplug and get on, you know, and they're up all hours of the night. So lying and sneaking around is a big one. So in order to have the addiction, signs of addiction and kind of be diagnosed and say, hey, you know, something's happening here, you need to have at least 3 of those symptoms. So now I'm giving you kind of like what to look for when it comes to addiction. And now I'm trying to give you something to go off of is this a problem? Is it emerging, or is this a full-blown problem? So casual is that those are people that can bounce in and out of these things. So they may play a couple hours and then get off, whether it's their phone or video games, and then move on to the next thing or do the homework, or come down for dinner and have meaningful conversations and have meaningful relationships outside of the time they're on the technology. So there's really good balance, and it's really not a problem with being excessive. And they generally have, we'll call them real friends, that people that they can associate with and be around and do things with. COVID isn't the outlier with this, but just in general. And then at risk is they're increasing time spent on screens and away from activities. So you're just seeing them kind of migrate more towards this one thing. It's close to the top of the list of their hobbies. It's becoming more of a regular activity. Their relationships, their real relationships are just, they're not getting out as much. They're not getting around them as much. They're maybe saying, you know, I want to spend more time online, or my friends are online, or the only time I can see them is online. I understand that's an issue right now during COVID. But a lot of the conversation, a lot of the thought is around these devices, whether it's a game or social media or whatever the case may be. And then full-blown addiction is, it's what you think of when anyone's addicted to anything. Everything revolves around this thing. When am I getting it? How long do I get on it? There's mood variability when you're on it. So these highs and lows, and it's not pleasurable. It's never enough. It's the only thing that they're using for their social outlets. They get angry and withdraw. They are lying. They're doing everything they can to bargain for it. They have these huge outbursts or these huge swoons in mood and depression. And so that's full-blown addiction. And then you've got at risk, so emerging, and then you got casual, which is, hey, everything's pretty cool and pretty fine. So things to consider if you're seeing some of that stuff. So if you're seeing some of those signs and you're seeing someone in more of the emerging or full-blown addiction, it's important to know what they're doing. It's important to understand the game. It's important just to sit down and watch them play the game. It's important to interact with them and see what the app is. There's a lot of good information out on the internet as far as here's what to consider, here's what this app does, here's, it's pretty innocuous or things to be aware of. It's important to see how they're engaging and how often they're engaging. All these platforms, whether it's Microsoft, which is Xbox, or PlayStation, Sony, Switch, PC, and even your phones and stuff like that, iPad, whatever, you can put parameters around it. You can look and see what the baseline of use is. It's like as far as how much they're using, how often they're picking something up, how much they're on particular apps. You can see all those things. There's metrics for all that stuff. So I would encourage you to have that. It kind of helps give you a guidance of what's going on. Is this really a problem or not? It's important to, when I say go the extra mile, to draw them into the family. Teenagers and tweens naturally kind of want to pull away. We call it kind of going away from orbit. And then generally they come back as young adults or adults. So there is some natural progression of that. So you want to account for that. If they're being moody or just not wanting to be around you all the time, like maybe they did, but you also need to factor in all these other things and say, is that change in the trajectory of that kid's orbit or that young adult's orbit? And so if you're seeing a big variance in that change in behavior, like we talked about before, that's something you want to do to kind of bring them in. So whether it's, let's play a board game night, you pick, or let's watch something on Netflix, because that's not as inducing as all this other stuff. Obviously help them get more sleep. It's the most important thing you can do. Teenagers need, 8 to 10, and your tweens need, and younger kids need 9 to 11. You need somewhere between 8 hours, give or take. We need all that to be optimal. Create schedules around screens, which we'll talk a little bit, but, set a hard cap for screens are off at this time, or we're not doing screens during the school week, or, you can play for 3 hours a day, but you can only play 1 hour at a time. And you use all that against, where are they on this emerging, casual, or addicted, to decide how much is enough. And then if you can, have technology-free days, which means we're not going to get on our phone, we're not going to get on the platforms, or have a technology-free morning if it's too hard to do a full day, or technology-free hour. You roll it back to a place where that becomes achievable, and so you can just detox your brain from those things. So other things you can do, especially for your teens and your young kids, is help them learn life skills. We are designed to do challenging things. It goes back to that dopamine. We need those challenges. With games and social media, we can get that dopamine at such a fast rate, you can't compete with that. Our brains aren't designed to be able to get that much dopamine at that much time over and over and over and over. So give them things to do, chores, life skills. We talk about like teaching kids how to do laundry, how to cook a grilled cheese, how to incorporate these things that they're going to need to do later in life, and start building on those now. Think of them like levels, like, you have them do this one thing, and once they show some mastery over that one thing, then maybe you move to the next thing. But you're teaching them life skills, and that gives them dopamine. I realize COVID is what it is, but we need social interaction. FaceTime is better than doing it over text or even over a mic. We have these things called mirror neurons. So the closer I get to the screen, the more you're going to tune in to what I'm doing. And the farther away I pull back, the less those mirror neurons are going to fire up. So if you can't do in person, which I understand, try to do things like that through FaceTime. All the other stuff is one-dimensional conversations, and there's no real reciprocity in those conversations, whether it's social media or text or whatever. So a lot of kids are struggling with these conflict resolution skills. I mean, adolescence and tweens is supposed to be hard. It's supposed to be awkward. It's supposed to be fraught with missteps and learning about those missteps, and not just canceling someone, rejecting someone, and jumping over to the next pod of like, okay, well, these are my people now. It's working through those things, and social interaction is the way to do that. It's how kids learn. Help them learn or re-engage with old hobbies, or help them learn new hobbies. It goes back to that dopamine stuff. Give them hard things, challenging things, and they'll get into it. It may take a while to find out what those hobbies are. It may not be sports, it may be cooking, it may be some kind of art, but get them involved in things, because you can't just take away the thing, whether it's technology of any sort, and not replace it with something, because the brain is craving that thing that it was getting, which is that dopamine and that oxytocin, that connection. And so it needs something to fill the space. And then obviously get them to exercise. Go exercise with them. Those things are important. Exercise is super important, just like sleep. All right, so if you have heard me talk before on some of the different talks that we've given, especially pandemic parenting, is take clarity breaks. So when we're doing something hard, we have adrenaline, and our eyes, which are an extension of our brain, are focused in on this task, whatever that task is. And if we pick up a phone, now we've gone from, let's say, a monitor, and now we're doing something on a much smaller screen, so there's more intimacy with that, and so there's no break from adrenaline. So when you have a clarity break, you put the screens down, you stand up, you go outside if you can, especially like today, it's nice, and you just stare off into the void. And that turns off that adrenaline switch and gives your brain a break. You should definitely do this for your online learners in between classes. Just go stare out into space, even if it's by the window. Doesn't matter if it's a rainy day or not. The brain likes sunshine. That helps with melatonin secretion and things like that we've talked about before. There's a lot of Behind the Door series about it. Be a good role model. So, one of the kind of most awkward times when we see clients is when we're talking about this stuff, and they'll point to their parent, oh, let's look at your screen time. And they'll the parent will say, well, we're not here for me, this is about you. And one of the things that's happened is, and the research is showing this, is that middle-aged women's screen time usage, and we won't call it addicted behavior, but emerging behavior has risen dramatically over the last 10 years because of these platforms and their engagement in these platforms. So be a good role model. If it's 2 hours, set a time for yourself for 2 hours too. Delay screens in infants and toddlers. There's very few things that make me cringe more than walking around department stores and seeing a little kid with a device. And it could be a very innocuous device or a game that they're playing, but the point is that they're being conditioned to this thing that demands their attention, and they're going to want it more. You see it when you go out. When we used to be able to go out and eat, it's become the babysitter, and sometimes we need that, especially in the day and age that we're in now. So I get it, but just be careful, because it goes back to that wiring and that pruning, and the more they're interacting on this thing, the more they're going to want to interact. There's some really cool apps out there. Obviously, you have screen time if it's iOS, but this one app called Moment, it will pop up and say, hey, you've been on your phone, X amount of minutes in a row, or X amount of minutes in a day, or, you've picked it up 10 times, and it allows you to set goals. And it's just a nice reminder, like, all right, you said you wanted to do this. And so it's a conscious reminder, like, this is going on. So you can do that across all platforms with everyone in your family. And then if you need to leverage something, you can have your kids do some of the things that we already talked about to earn that screen time by doing offline activities. I see one question, I'll come back to that because that may be something we can wrap up at the end. So action plan, take the criteria that we talked about as far as addiction and your level of concern. So kind of take those things and say, I don't have that much to worry about, I'll keep my eye on it, or wow, we've got a big problem. And so some of the clients will come in and like, we have a big problem, like they're addicted. Everything's drawn around that behavior. They're 10 years old and they're having just like pure fits of rage and being destructive physically because they're not getting what they want. and they've been doing that for a while, and that's just kind of that dopamine. And when you don't have it, the brain wants it. If they're emerging, put some hard caps or of time around that. For instance, you say, well, we're just going to do 2 hours a day. And if you're still seeing problems with that behavior, you can continue to roll it down from a duration standpoint of like, all right, we'll do an hour and a half, or we'll do an hour. And you may have to do a hard reset of just detoxing for a while. And that while could be a day, it could be a couple weeks. We've got a client that I see that he's addicted, and he's like 10 or 11. And so we're treating it like you're going to take at least a month, 2 months off to let the brain reset, and let some of that wiring reset. And then we can slowly introduce devices, whether it's online learning or things like that. And then you can use therapy to do the cognitive behavioral part of like what to do with these intense emotions, instead of having these outbursts. And then you emphasize personal relationships, hobbies, and sports. If they're addicted, first thing you do is you take away the devices, you detox it from them just like you would a drug addict. And then you use regular therapy as its first line of intervention to see if it will hit and work. And then, in the worst instances of the spectrum, there's kids that are going to, residential treatment centers because they can't handle it. And you're seeing them, they'll come out, kind of go back, think they can handle it, just like someone that has alcohol or whatever, and they're relapsing. So it can be it's a spectrum, and at the worst end of the spectrum, it can be really, really bad. All right. And then the last slide, just kind of things to consider. Did we answer these questions? Are kids failing to meet adult milestones? Is attention span being impacted? What are the biggest fights you're getting into with your kids? Are our devices, what are they doing to our sleep? What are they doing to our mental state? And is the human brain built to handle the multitude of social integration opportunities? The number of influencers that we now have in our life, is the brain designed to do that? So I see one question. I have a 12-year-old boy. Do you think it's better to give them all their daily screen time allotment at once, or insist they space it out? I would go back to that last screen and just base that decision on what you're seeing from the behavior. If they can get on, use it, and get off, more of a casual user, then that would be okay. If you're seeing more of that emergence, so you're seeing a lot, maybe more resistance, maybe more bargaining, or more temperament before and after, well, then you may need to go back and just look at it from a duration standpoint and like, all right, let's break this thing up. Let's break it in half or break it into thirds, however you may want to do it. And that helps guide you what your next steps are. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. And once again, I apologize for not sharing it in the beginning. And then unmute to let y'all know, see if y'all have any questions. So does anyone have any questions? Oh, there's one, I'm sorry. Would you recommend talking to a teen about this? Explain to them tendency for addiction. The action plan seems unilateral. Things parents do. Thanks to the rest of it. Yeah, I mean, I mean, in the practice, it's like one of the first things we screen. I'm very interested in your sleep, and I'm very interested in your screen time. And if there's any substance use issues too. But we're doing that across the spectrum of little kids, tweens, teens, and adults, because it is so, at least in the practice, it feels so rampant. And so, yes, I would talk to them about this. We talk to them using slightly different words depending on the age. But certainly I would have these conversations, and just like you would with anything, like kind of making a family decision. This is a family value, and this is how we want to go about doing that.
Ken, I also just wanted to make one comment. That was my question. That one maybe more data point related to some of the things you said was that being able to get to know these YouTubers and gamers and streamers, I think is like even an additional charge to the dopamine, meaning like it's not only that you like this person, but it's that you can talk to him, or he may, like your, your video or whatever. And I feel like that personal connection is creating like a false sense of having relationships with these people. It's just something that we're kind of seeing in our house.
Yeah, it's like Brad Pitt acknowledging you and having a conversation with you one time. And it feels incredibly wonderful from an oxytocin standpoint, because the YouTubers are these kids, adolescents, they're celebrities. They're who they're into. They're who they care about. And there's a multitude of them. So it kind of goes back to that whole, 31,000 to 40-some thousand apps. I mean, I forget how many people are on YouTube and how many create a YouTube channel. So you can't keep up with all of it, but you can keep up who your kids are streaming and who they follow and who they watch, and sit down with them and watch it with them and ask them questions rather than necessarily judge. Just be curious, like how and what. Those are always great questions. So you can at least learn, like, all right, is this somebody that I really want my kid to understand and be around, or is this somebody that I don't think this is a good idea? Any other questions?
About sleep time?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
The question is there a period of time prior to falling asleep that you should make sure that they're not on any electronic devices?
It's absolutely an hour. It can be more, but purely from a melatonin standpoint, which is what gets us there, you want to have good hygiene, sleep hygiene, and a good routine. So you want to do the same thing the same way each night at the same time. And all those are markers to your brain to start secreting melatonin, which it's naturally going to do when the sun sets anyway. And blue light has the ability to suppress that melatonin. So everything's off an hour prior to bed. And if the way you can judge that is if after, and this takes a while, after 30 days, you're still seeing some difficulties falling asleep, you may want to say 1 hour and a half. And then there's other underlying variables. If some kids have actual sleep problems, and then that's sometimes when we recommend sleep studies. If we've done all the behavioral things, we've done all the tinkering, and yet it still is a problem with them not falling asleep. Some kids have restless legs. Some kids even that we've seen have sleep apnea, that kind of stuff. But you want to start with the hour first.
Did you also say that the devices themselves shouldn't even be in the room?
Yes, sir. If at all possible.
Even though they're turned off?
Even though they're turned off, because if your phone is by you right now, which more than likely it is, because it's usually never within an arm's length, it is a distraction, because you are, in some instances, people think they hear stuff. They think they hear notifications, and that's why they're constantly checking. And so it is a distraction just by it being in a room, especially for a kid, because you're being programmed to check. And so you become automated to that programming.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions before we hop off? I want to be respectful of everybody's time. Okay. Well, I appreciate y'all being here. I apologize for the screens. We'll have it loaded up. If there's things, feedback, we love to have feedback, honest feedback about anything that we can improve. Or where it just didn't hit the mark, and that way we can improve upon it, because we're going to keep doing these. We're going to do a couple in December and then January. And if you have questions beyond this, feel free to reach out to me. Y'all have a great day. Bye.